Just a warning, this episode contains topics and/or language that could be heavy or triggering and may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Sometimes we really don't think about the origins of the things that we deem as important. We don't think about the fact that at one time there was a need for something to be created or invented. Someone had to come up with an idea and someone had to perfect it. Marty Goddard did just that. She's credited with helping develop the rape kit that most of us use today. It's small, it's clinical, and it's been used in thousands of cases across the country.
For many years, the rape kit served a crucial part of the investigative process, designed to collect forensic evidence from survivors of sexual violence. Its purpose is clear: to gather the evidence needed to help bring justice to those who have suffered sexual violence.
Journalist Pagan Kennedy had her own questions about the origins of the rape kit, and all of her hard work digging into it led her to discovering the work of Marty Goddard. Pagan Kennedy is the author of The Secret History of the Rape Kit, a true crime story. As she explores in her book, the kit's history is complicated. In some cases, it's been the key to solving crimes and holding perpetrators accountable, while in other cases, it's been left in evidence lockers untouched for decades.
We're lucky to have Pagan with us today to break it all down.
Hey Pagan, how are you today?
I'm good. Yeah, thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself for people who don't know?
So I am a longtime journalist. I've written 12 books, which is possible because I'm old. I've had various jobs at the New York Times as columnist at the magazine and worked on the opinion page for a while.
And you're joining us today because you're the author of The Secret History of the Rape Kit. Can you tell us about the book?
So yeah, this book started for me. I mentioned that I was working on the opinion page and I was a contributing writer there in 2018. And at that time, there was a huge backlog in the rape kits. You know, they were being held in. There was about almost 500,000 that hadn't been processed by police departments. So the headlines were full of news. This scandal had kind of erupted. And I don't know, sort of one day, I think that's why they were in my mind. And then I suddenly thought, wow, isn't it crazy that there even are rape kits? That there was this one thing, this national system where in theory, anybody could walk in and report a sexual assault and then be taken seriously and then have this forensic exam. And then the, DNA would be collected and analyzed. That seemed really amazing to me. So that's how I began the book. And I didn't know I was writing a book at all then. It was just, what is this? I need to think about this. So I looked up the origins of the rape kit on Wikipedia. And at that time, it said that the sole inventor of the kit was a Chicago police officer named Louis Vitullo, which there were many things wrong about that story that was being told then, as I would later discover. In the beginning, I just wanted to know more. So I quickly learned that Vitullo himself was dead, and so I couldn't interview him. But as I kind of Googled around, I found another name, Marty Goddard, this activist who was sort of described as his helper, who'd been involved. And so I really wanted to talk to her because I thought, well, she's the one alive, clearly, because I can't find her obituary. I couldn't find anything So I started hunting for her, and that's kind of how I fell down the rabbit hole. I was both searching to understand the story of how this incredible system got built in a time when, marital rape was legal in the country, when sexual assault was sort of considered a crime you could never solve. It was like a he said, she said. Police handbooks of the time said that most of the accusers were just liars. So it was up to the job of the police officer to decide who was lying and who wasn't. And mostly they would, I think, decide that the accusers were lying. And so the officers themselves, this was not an evidence-based system. It was very much about the police officers themselves deciding who was a legitimate victim and who wasn't. And so how, again, I was trying to solve that mystery of how did this come to be in the midst of this at that time, and also still continuing to search for Marty Goddard, who just had vanished more completely than any person I'd ever tried to chase down.
Is that why you wanted to write this book on this subject, or?
Well, again, I wasn't really thinking book. I wasn't thinking anything. In fact, I was supposed to write a whole other book, and I was supposed to be writing shorter pieces for the opinion page, but I couldn't stop working on this project because every time I turned a corner, it became more interesting and surprising. Eventually, I managed to, so I didn't know what I was doing. I thought at the time it wasn't going to be an opinion piece because it was just spiraling out of control, frankly. I think I had 60,000 words at some point where I was just writing down notes and piecing together the story. And my editor at the New York Times was on maternity leave. So I sort of felt like I was in hiding from my deadlines because she wasn't going to ask me for anything for a while. But when she came back, I said, look, I'm working on this crazy thing. It's way too long to be an opinion piece. And she said, well, good news. I've just been hired to be the enterprise editor, which means super long stories. So suddenly I had this amazing opportunity to do it as a very long piece for the New York Times. And that's how I started. Yeah, so I just kept working to solve the basic two mysteries of what had happened to Marty Goddard and also how did the rape kit come to be. And I wrote about that in the Times, but honestly, there was so much more that didn't fit in the story. And then after this piece came out, it kind of went crazy viral. And I just heard from so many more people who had so many more pieces of the story to tell. So that's kind of how it just wanted to be a book.
You talked a little bit about how things were at the time in the 70s, before the rape kit was invented. But if you could talk about it a little bit more, go a little deeper, what was the process once you had a sexual assault survivor? What was the process for any investigation that they might have done?
So if the person were violently attacked, they would go to the hospital, or they might go to the police first, and then the police would take the victim to the hospital, and they might yell out, I'm taking this all from accounts, they might yell out, hey, we got a rape here, as they pulled the woman in to the ER.
They would just yell that out?
Yes, I found one account. So then the victim goes in. They may have stab marks or whatever. They may have been violently attacked. And so then the nurses and doctors are just trying to treat them for whatever they've got, whatever wounds they have or whatever. They're just trying to help them. And they had never been trained in forensics, any of them. And so they would do their best. They would bag up whatever seemed like evidence, and that would all get sent to the crime lab. But because nobody would train them, once it gets to the crime lab, the guys in the crime lab open it up and are like, what is this? And they just throw it out. And that would be a very typical thing. And then because there was kind of no communication and no organization, and then also there was no sense of trauma care. The police, after the hospital, the victim would be driven home, often in a police cruiser, wearing nothing but a hospital Johnny, and have to do this, get out of the police cruiser. This is something Marty Goddard actually talked about. She was very upset about the treatment of the survivors. She's like, so you're going to get out of You're going to go home in Chicago in the winter wearing nothing but a police Johnny. And then your neighbors see a police cruiser drive up and you walk out like half naked enough to go in your house. This is not acceptable. So, and the funny thing is, there were a few experiments with rape kits, and there's before the one in Chicago that became our national system. But there's nothing magical about a rape kit itself. Like, they can be very bad. And there were some very bad ones. So, when I started this, I thought the one in Chicago was the first one, but then I found evidence of other little experiments. And there was even one where the instructions said, if the woman is, it's like a low-class sleazy prostitute or something like that, you don't need to collect the evidence. But, if she's a little girl walking to Sunday school, then collect the evidence. So it's very much like not an evidence-based evidence system. You don't prejudge what you're going to collect. You don't just not collect. And so when one of the things that Marty Goddard really wanted to address was not only training the nurses in forensics and getting them to talk to the crime lab and getting the crime lab trained in all of this too, but also to really create what we would call now a data-based sort of scientific system where you do not prejudge, you just collect the evidence. The crime lab shouldn't know anything about who that victim is. None of their business. Their job is to just analyze, what they find. So that was really the heart of it. And she did work with the crime lab and Louis Vitullo, who was later credited as the sole inventor, on creating this prototype. But she was really the one who created this new set of ideas that it could be survivor-centered and really that you would need to take the bias out of the system and you need to train everybody. Like, so much of it was not in the rape kit itself. It's a system, and you need to get it into hospitals. You need to standardize it. And she actually had to raise all the money for the pilot program as well. She was the one who, pretty clear, it wouldn't have happened without her.
How was sexual assault viewed by the public and law enforcement at the time when the first kit just came out?
Yeah, so, I think one thing that's so interesting about the Marty Goddard story was I learned she left behind several oral history interviews, one of which was super obscure, and I was able to track that down. And all of this gave me a lot of sense of how she even first had the idea that sexual assault and child abuse was an epidemic and something that needed attention. And so the story really starts in a place I didn't expect at all, which was a hotline in downtown Chicago, where she volunteered to answer calls from what was then called runaway teenagers. And at the time, this is the early 70s. So people think kids are running away to be hippies and have fun and take drugs or something. But when she actually answered these calls, she discovered a lot of these kids were actually running away from abuse in their homes. Specifically what she called incest. That's what they would have called it. But, it was all right there in people's faces, but they didn't see it. Child abuse was thought to be really rare. Part of it was that, if a 13-year-old girl ended up turning tricks on the street, she would be called a prostitute. And literally found unfortunately, that happens now still. But it was just very widespread then to think it's the fault of the girl somehow. And nobody kind of asking the very obvious question to us now of well, wait, how does a 13-year-old end up on the street engaged in prostitution? What happened before that? Who's behind that? So Marty Goddard was asking those questions and got very, very upset about the fact that these girls were being blamed for what happened to them. And then, often they'd be sent off to a juvenile hall where they would be subjected to even more sexual assault. She was really trying to get a handle on, and also thinking, well, if this is so widespread, there must be zillions of perpetrators out there. Why do we not know about this? Why are we not tracking this? Why are, almost no cases going to trial? So she began digging into that. And then sort of before the the height of the anti-rape movement, but I would say that really started in about 1974, where you suddenly see rape crisis centers popping up everywhere. And, it was the first generation of women graduating from law school. So it was like, it all happened very fast. And at that time, Marty Goddard was put on a citizens committee of a rape task force, and she was allowed to go ask all her questions to the crime lab and the hospital workers and sort of gather, almost like a journalist, just sit down with everybody and say, okay, what actually happens? What's going wrong? Da, 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 da. So she started to diagnose all the problems in the system. And that was how she kind of developed this idea that we need to all have this common language of forensics, that the nurses need to understand what the crime lab needs. They need to collect evidence, create a chain of evidence. The police officers need to be trained to not abuse the victims, on and on. So she was trying to build that entire system and change kind of the norms.
How did Vitullo come into the picture?
So as far as I've been able to piece together exactly how that happened, Marty Goddard and her friend who was working closely with her, Cynthia Gary, who knew a lot about police brutality and had been working on that issue, they had an ally inside the Chicago Police Department, which was very corrupt at that time. And this guy, Rudy Nimitz, and he was an African-American police officer who had grown up on the streets and had really, was able to tell them how to navigate through the police department and deal with all the egos and the difficulties and that they were going to find as people trying to make change. And so he, according to what I've been able to figure out, he was the one who said, look, you need to go talk to this guy Vitullo in the crime lab. And this Vitullo was sort of Chicago famous at the time because he had been involved in some high profile cases. And so Marty Goddard did go to see him and brought a bunch of her ideas to him. And again, the rape kits already existed, so they probably both knew vaguely. Maybe it's hard to know. I have no window into their heads, but this would have been like in the air. But she kind of brought the idea of like creating a real system around kits, it seems like, to him. And he threw her out, according to one account I have, just for having the gall to come in and tell him what to do. But then days later, he turned around and had built a prototype of this kit and sort of came around to it. But I think, from that interaction, it was probably very clear that his name needed to be on it for everything, for the system to go forward. Marty Goddard had created a nonprofit that she ran, and she used that to fund the pilot program for the rape kit and everything. And there is a trademark under her nonprofit calling this new kit the Vitullo Evidence Kit. So it was clearly her decision to name it that. But I think, given everything I've been able to reconstruct, you sort of didn't have a choice. This was going to need to be under the police department or the state's attorney's office or something like that. They were going to have to take all the credit and their name was going to have to be on it in order to launch this big system where everybody was going to, be involved. She needed buy-in from a lot of people.
I know we've been talking about Marty Goddard, but who was she really?
When the story begins, she was newly divorced woman in her early 30s, kind of this lanky blonde woman with big googly glasses that she kind of hid behind. And she wore very professional clothes. She really was aware that she had to be taken seriously to get stuff done. And so she was very interested in, and it was hard for her because women couldn't get credit cards in their own names at this time. So she was, one thing she talked about was just all the impediments of just being able to put together like a professional suit and trying to get credit to do that and create her wardrobe and create the look of somebody who was like, she was working at a philanthropic organization at that time. So she was just constantly meeting with people and asking them questions, but trying to get things done. And so she was very, very good at getting into rooms and convincing people. And she made it clear that there were a lot of feminists, outside the police department screaming about the pigs. And she was the one who was going to walk in and talk to them and wear her business suit and listen to them and work with them and get stuff done. Another crazy part of the story is she ended up having to work with the Playboy Foundation because it turned out, at that time, it was the only place where she could raise money for something this radical. And so the pilot project was funded by the Playboy Foundation, and they even had apparently some fundraisers at the Playboy Mansion. And she said, the really hardline feminists didn't like that at all and criticized her. But she was, at the end of the day, she's like, I'm going to do what I need to do to get this done. And it's just going to happen. So she was that really no bullshit. A friend of hers described her, as the no bullshit, fucking relentless, I think was the term she used, person who, ultimately rose to being really a mover and shaker in Chicago by the end of the 70s.
For those who don't know, what exactly is a rape kit and what's in it? Is it an actual kit?
Yes. So the kit then, in Chicago, that is the initial one that spawned all the other ones, was very simple. It was a cardboard box. And if you open the lid, it had a checklist of things you were supposed to do. It was about 10 things. Collect this swab, collect that swab, collect, nails, do this, do that. And then a very simple array of tools that would be like some collection envelopes and things like that to collect swabs, some comb and bag for collecting the clothes and stuff. Now, at this time, there was no DNA identification hadn't been invented yet. So they were collecting swabs, biological, like blood and semen. But what you could know from that was pretty limited. Like you could look at a blood type, say, of the perpetrator, but obviously that doesn't really narrow it down much. So they also were trying to document the harm to the victim's body really carefully. And what's really crazy is that a rape kit today looks almost like that, but it's a lot more confusing because lots of committees have stuffed it with more and more and more envelopes. It might take you a full minute to lay out just all the envelopes, the different that are for this kind of swab and that kind of swab and this, 99% of which nobody will ever use, but it's just and then the instructions might be, 4 or 5 pages of dense instructions. And the reason I'm saying might be because there is no standardized kit. There's probably more than 1,000 different ones. Even in the same city, there can be different kits. That is not good. That is a problem because it obviously means that, for the people trying to do this, we now have trained forensic nurses, but they're in really short supply. So often it's not a forensic nurse who's doing this. And so if you can imagine yourself working in an ER and you've never seen a rape kit and you're a nurse and you have to do it and you open it up and there's 3 dozen envelopes and this, instructions on everything's on paper still. And you're really pressed for time. This forensic exam can take up to 5 hours and you're figuring it out as you go along. That is not a good situation. So that's the situation we're in now. And often the crime labs have a lot of power now in asking for what they want in the kits. And so they might say, well, we need to know what medications the victim is on or whether she's on birth control, or even psych meds. and they may want to know the full story of her account or ask for that story. None of this they should be knowing, because again, the whole point of sending it to a crime lab is like, you don't know anything. Your job in the crime lab is to not know anything. Just look at the data, test the DNA, test whatever, see if the swabs, what they contain, see if you can test them, report the DNA. And you just don't want to create more bias inside of that system. Well, there's a lot of problems that still need to be solved. I will say that when we pay attention to this and when we work together, we can solve these problems because the backlog has shrunk. Thanks to all these amazing activists and groups like End the Backlog. It was once at about 400,000. It's now at about 50,000. And that, I feel like people don't know that. They still think that there's this enormous backlog. And I think it's really important to know that that worked, like activism worked. And if you kind of put that attention onto other things, other problems in the system, then we could fix these other problems as well.
When and where was the first kit used, and what was the reaction, the response?
So the first kits, I don't know about the very first kit. And again, it's like kind of murky because there were other kits in other cities and stuff and little. But the ones in Chicago were rolled out, I believe it was 1978 when they actually got into hospitals. And then there were more and more hospitals. And then all of the whole state had this system. And the reaction nationwide was a lot of excitement. There were national stories about, hey, in Chicago, there's this whole new system, and this could really lead to knowing a lot more about, like finally we'll have real evidence of sexual assault, and many of these cases might stand up in court, and this could really change things. And that led to other cities around the country asking Marty Goddard to help them set up their own systems.
I'm assuming it was pretty easy for people to kind of adapt and start using these as they rolled out, and they're probably, adopted pretty quickly to using the kit, or the updated kit, as you said, because there was an earlier one. But what was the first use of the kit, let's say, in like a court case for conviction or anything like that?
I think there was a bus driver who assaulted a woman, and that was in the late 70s. And I think that was the first court case. I believe it did lead to a conviction. But, what stood out, and especially in these articles that were written about the kit, was when they interviewed juries who were in court cases where the kit had been used. So if you can picture, pre-kit or pre this system, the survivor might be standing up and she's going to be grilled by the other side and they're going to destroy her reputation, right? Now you have a nurse or somebody from the crime lab coming in a white coat with this graphs and, whatever, sciencey things. And the jury, is really much more convinced because again, it's a culture of disbelief in accusers. But when you have, first of all, that the victim was willing to go through this incredible process. And, they would also document the violence against her on her body and stuff. So this was seen as really a step up in terms of almost the theater of the courtroom. But then what really, really changed was when you begin to get in the late 80s, early 90s, as DNA identification comes along. So now, if you think about it, there's these thousands of kits nationwide, and they are full of this biological material that suddenly lets you pinpoint an exact suspect, or just as important, rule out a suspect. And very quickly, the Exoneration Project comes along in the 90s and realizes, wow, this is a really huge tool. And often it was the samples in the rape kits that could be used for exoneration of innocent men who had been wrong. There's just such a history of wrongly accusing Black men in America of rape. And so this became a really important tool in pushing back against that.
What role did forensic science play in changing the way that sexual assault cases were or are handled by law enforcement?
It's really hard to change the culture in policing. I think what the kit represented was the fundamental idea that you could prove that sexual assault happened, that there could be evidence, and it wasn't this giant murky cloud where it'd be like, oh, we could never know, because it's just a he said, she said. We could never know, but, obviously there's a lot of cases where DNA can't shed light on consent. But, if the DNA of the same perpetrator shows up in multiple kits, then it's pretty clear what happened. So that linking together of kits is really important. And that's something, so I should say that as soon as, we talked about these kits being tested for DNA, even the older ones in the 90s, this begins. But it was very expensive to do that. So even though there was no real activism around the rape kit backlog until the 2010s. The backlog started as soon as there could be a backlog, basically. As soon as there was DNA testing, I went in and found all these newspaper articles from the 90s where often people in the police department or detectives or whatever were like, look, we've got, thousands of these kits in our warehouse and we haven't tested them. Like, we have to do this. And every city was starting to have backlogs and just not testing kits. And this is, by the way, at a time when funding for police departments was ballooning. It really did create a different ethic at some level, but it was very hard at another level. There's kind of a constant battle between this idea that the accuser should be treated like a suspect and is she pure? That idea of like, is she a virgin? Is she the girl going to Sunday school? Or is she, somehow not a liar or trying to get revenge on her boyfriend or something, as the police handbook would say? That, it's very, very hard to stamp that out of the system. But certainly, relying on DNA evidence, which is pretty hard to refute, it was very helpful. And forensic nursing became a new discipline, basically, in the 1980s. There were forensic nursing groups and you could go to school for it. Now it's a pretty big subset of nursing. And so they created whole new ideas about trauma-informed care and how you collect evidence and all of that. And so that's been really, really important as well in changing the culture.
What caused the backlog, and, also wondering how expensive it is to test a kit.
Last time I checked, it was around $1,000. But obviously in the 90s, I think it was around that, but that was a lot more, inflation adjusted, it was a lot more. So it was quite expensive in the 90s. And yeah, so that cost has been something of an impediment. There's people working on different ways to bring that down and speed up the testing and all of that. But, I would say that police departments seem to get things like robot dogs and bomb sniffers and things like that. Sort of solving like very basic crimes, it seems like something that we could manage to do.
And how expensive would like each kit themselves be?
To make the kit, it's negligible. They're mostly paper, a lot of paper, which is like another problem because this is sort of post-book, but I've been thinking a lot about how the future of evidence is really going to be digital because DNA can tell you who was there, but it can't tell you anything about what they were thinking or what their intentions were or if they were being violent. But like it or not, everything we do is now recorded, and that is only going to get more crazy in the future. The amount that we are recorded as we walk down the street or that, as we interact with people and all of that, it's amazing how much you can know. And that will tell you the intention. It will tell you if there was a threat. It will tell you, what was actually going on leading up to and even during the assault. And so that there's the French case that's going on, and I always forget her last name, but Giselle was drugged and assaulted endlessly by her husband. And then he brought in over 50 men while she was drugged, and they also assaulted her, and he videotaped the whole thing. One thing you kind of learn, I think Hollywood likes to create the idea that these serial abusers and serial killers and serial rapists are geniuses and that they're, playing 5-level chess. And, a lot of them are stupidly recording every illegal thing they do, maybe paying for underage prostitutes on Venmo, that kind of evidence. And that evidence, having the videos, has of these men and these ordinary men, just guys, I think there's a reckoning in France right now because it's so shocking that so many of these guys would participate in this. And, it's like they're the guys next door. And so, yeah, I think that, I'm wondering about the future. I think we need to start looking ahead to the future of evidence and making sure that we have trauma-informed care in that area, that the survivor's cell phone isn't taken away by the police and that they don't kind of strip search her cell phone to find out, to try to discredit her, that she herself, as in the physical exam, is allowed to give her evidence that's relevant, like threatening texts or something, but that's not an invitation to the police to go hunting around in every aspect of her previous dating history, which is not germane to the case. That is as bad as these old-fashioned ways that the survivors were given quote unquote exams. Like if you look into the prehistory, the earliest cases, often in the 19th century or whatever, the victim might be examined by a doctor to see if she was a virgin. So we don't need people like going into survivors' phones to see if they were virgins or not, essentially. Yeah, so I think that it's time it would be really important for us to have a conversation about like what kind of evidence we can, do we really works in terms of standing up in court, and how do we collect that in a way that is fair to the survivors, and how do we create way more access for survivors to report and submit evidence? Because right now it's extremely hard to do that, and we ask way too much of the survivors. I mean, the average sort of experience somebody might have is that after an assault, you have to find a hospital that with an ER that can do the forensic exam. Not all of them can. You probably have to drive an hour or something to find the right ER. And then you would have to wait in the waiting room we all know ER waiting rooms, you might be there for 8 or 10 hours. And then there's an exam that's very invasive and can be traumatic and takes up to 5 hours. So what we're excluding there is a lot of people don't have cars. A lot of people have kids at home and they cannot go just disappear for 24 hours, or they have the kind of jobs where they can't do that. Or people are just too traumatized to undergo this, to even leave their houses or leave their friends after this experience. So I think that's something we really need to have a survivor-led conversation about what is reasonable to really ask of people. One thing I've been finding is like when you bring that up, people will sort of inside the system who are all wonderful and well-meaning, but they will tell you, but if we did it any other way, it won't stand up in court. And I think that we have the ability to not traumatize survivors and also create evidence that will stand up in court. And what I found is like the system has beaten down a lot of really good people. And so kind of more of us need to come in and say, look, we can do hard things. We can change this. And I think one reason that the whole system's still on paper is because, as soon as you hit the court system, they want exactly the kind of evidence that they've always had since the 1970s. In my opinion now, having talked to a lot of people, that's the thing we most need to talk about and change and draw attention to, that, it's just not relevant anymore.
I was going to mention one other thing that could be used, because I think it played a role in the Lake and Riley case, be like a smartwatch, like heart rate monitor, because then, like it's tracking your GPS if you're actually out running or, walking wherever you are, if it's going up at a particular time, things like that.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. I mean, we know where everybody, sadly, I guess, we know where everybody is, like through multiple means, like your smartwatch. But then meanwhile, there's like all these cameras in the park that are like tracking. I mean, seriously, the amount we know is crazy. And, I think that, I haven't seen, and I'm really digging into how this digital forensics is used in sexual assault, and it's super hard to find out exactly what happens. In Britain, there was a big scandal because of what they call digital strip searching of survivors' phones, where the police would just take the phone and then try to use the victim's history or something. They could, you can imagine your phone, like somebody's always going to find something that probably doesn't make you look good, and the police would take, confiscate that and use it to try to ruin the victim's reputation and kill the case. And so that was outlawed in Britain. But I haven't found anything. I'm still wondering, like, how much does that happen? And this is stuff I can't stop. Like, I finished the book, but I can't stop reporting it, just because I'm now meeting really interesting people and who know a lot of stuff, and I just keep finding out more. And I also wonder about all the DNA information now. The data goes to the CODIS system inside the FBI. That represents decades of data from so many survivors' kits, and it's very, very precious.
What is still shocking and surprising to you?
I mean, part of the book was I was trying to think about sexual assault in a way, or I was trying to share my reactions to specifically things that were going on as I was writing the book in a way that I thought was sort of emblematic of what so many other people were feeling. For me, I only realized later, after I was well into the project, that in a way, I thought that I had been focusing on the rape kit because it was sort of in the news. But then it became obvious to me that the Kavanaugh hearings were also happening. And so I was thinking there was so many feelings that I had about it and so many other people had about it. And I think especially women of my generation who are about Dr. Ford's age, I had something happen to me that was very similar to her. And like her, I told nobody, and that experience was, especially for us growing up in the late 20th century, I mean, that was very, very normal to have something like that happen and just never tell anybody, but trying to figure it out in your own head. And so I think, with the Me Too revelations and the Epstein trials and the Kavanaugh hearings and all of that, I was trying to also articulate this new way that we were all feeling about sexual assault. And I think part of that is the realization of just how widespread it is, and that we often talk about it. We treat it as if it's kind of like we treat it case by case. We always talk about this case and that case, but it's clear that there's as many people affected by this as by, say, cancer or heart disease. It's an epidemic. I think a lot of us have been thinking and feeling about it more as part of the power structure and part of a mass social problem. And, unfortunately, survivors have often been encouraged to feel very alone and like their case is special, or, and I think the coming together of survivors and this awareness of each other is very, very powerful. And I was trying to also articulate that and think about it. And I had to invent this word, ungaslighting, which was what happened to me when I saw 1 million people on Twitter saying, me too. This happened to me. They're, often like the Twitter dam broke in like 2017 during the Me Too movement. And you would just see people saying, Me Too, my father, or Me Too in second grade or whatever. They wouldn't say much, but you sensed the whole story behind that. And the scope of it was just so horrifying. And yet it made me feel like I wasn't crazy because, of course, we're all aware of this in the background, but having it be talked about and feeling like, okay, this thing is real. Like, it was it really switched something in my brain. And I think for a lot of other people, it really helped them feel like very empowered. I think that we just thinking a lot about what can be done now and just having these conversations and reminding ourselves that sexual assault is illegal. It is a crime. It can be proven is really important. And just holding on to that territory, which is and they are trying to take that back from us right now.
Were there any difficulties in testing rape kits? I just wonder how long it actually takes to complete testing from start to finish, right? So once a kit is, opened up and used to sending it out, getting it tested, having it returned with results.
Could take forever, could take never happens at all. It can be pretty quick. There's still a bureaucracy. So I don't know the fastest kit, but I think it can happen pretty, in months or something. But I will say that about half the states now have instituted. So I mentioned the kits are paper, but they've instituted a tracking system that's sort of like UPS. So there would be like a code on the kits, and then the survivor could go back in and check if her kit has been tested. No, I don't think they get the results, but you would see where it's moving, just like UPS. You would see okay, it's gone to the crime lab. Now it's waiting in line to be tested. Now it is tested. Now da-da-da. So that's great in a way, except for every state has its own different tracking system. And none of this is integrated into this paper kit that's still paper. So again, this is not the system we would set up now. So the government agency NIST that does regulations and standards, they are actually now working on creating one standard kit. You wouldn't have to use, but that would be recommended to all states everywhere. And I asked one of the people on the committee, okay, but what about the tracking systems? They're not standardized and they're all different in every state, and not a lot of states don't even have them. And she just sighed. She's like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that one. Again, I think this is when you have people kind of ordinary citizens coming in from the outside and looking at this. It's, again, like looking at the backlog. And again, I feel frustrated that we have to create this enormous tracking system simply because we can't trust the police to do their jobs. So I think there's a conversation that needs to be had here again. If nothing else, it's certainly much better to have these tracking systems than nothing at all. So that is a huge win. And certainly has been a win for the backlog, because now you can say with certainty, which states have run through their backlogs and which ones haven't.
What are the impacts that this has on a survivor?
It's so devastating. And even when a survivor misidentifies her perpetrator, I think she gets blamed and stuff, but it's very hard to identify somebody when if you're really super traumatized. And I think the cruelty of not testing the kits and putting the wrong man in prison is just compounded with also the pain of that survivor when she finds out that she was part of that, and just the lives that it ruins. But there's a really great book called Is Rape Even a Crime? And she was Michelle, and I am forgetting her last name, but she was assaulted brutally in the 1980s. And her case of how the police treated her, what happened to the kit she filed, and all of that, it is devastating to read. And she makes it very clear that what happened with the police was worse than a violent sexual assault. the trauma that can be inflicted on survivors by this system is enormous. So it's really, really important to have a conversation about this. And again, we should have survivors at the front end deciding how this evidence system works.
Was there any particular story or element that you came across from your research or just speaking to people that really stood out to you?
I think it was really the Kavanaugh hearings that was just this theater of humiliation. It just crystallizes everything about the way survivors are handled, because it's like, this woman's she didn't have to do this. People don't report rape for fun. This is horrible. And it's so difficult to do. And she was so brave to come up and and speak. And the amount of humiliation she's put through, it was just so painful to watch. And then I think everything about that case encapsulates the bigger issues of power and sexual assault. That kind of story is all too frequent. It's a story in my own life. And when, a young man or a boy is being groomed to be powerful, he often, in a frat or whatever, he will bully others, might assault people, and this will be proof that he's, one of the lions, one of the predators who's going to succeed. And that's very much the culture of the power system we have now, which is you prove your ability to be a leader essentially by assaulting or victimizing or bullying others. And I think that's, just such an important thing that we need to talk about and be aware of. And I think that with the Kavanaugh hearings, we have this vivid story of this one woman's life, but we also have kind of the story of like how power works in America. And that is kind of the rocket fuel, that made me really want to look into this and say, and again, it's the Kavanaugh thing is like, well, we can never know. It's he said, she said, or whatever, the Clarence Thomas thing. And who is this victim and this accuser, and what are her motives? And we can, particularly going forward in an age where everything's tracked, we can have evidence, we can figure this out. And we need to hold these people to account.
What is something that you would say to someone who's been assaulted and might be nervous about getting a rape kit done?
I would first of all say that if you feel like you can't do it, you don't have to report. But it's probably not a bad idea for people to figure out ahead of time, like where you would go, where you would feel comfortable going. Is there a hospital near you with a really good forensic nursing system, or where you would take a friend? Not a bad idea. Really important on campus, because a lot of times the students are pretty far from a hospital, or it's not easy for them to get into the official policing system. The campus police arrive and the university immediately tries to treat it as an internal affair. And that's been a big issue on campuses, that it's not treated as like an actual crime. It's treated as a kind of internal university affair. So I think it's very good to know ahead what you think you would do, who you would go to. Is there somebody who can help? I will say that one wonderful thing is that most hospitals give you a victim advocate. So there are these wonderful volunteers who, just bless them. These people, this is hard work, and they volunteer to meet the victim in the ER, sit with them the whole time, get whatever they need, be with them through the exam, advocate for them. If they're feeling uncomfortable or they're too upset, just shut the whole thing down, help really be the voice of the survivor. And so there will be somebody with you, but of course, it's very good to bring your people. And you can say no at any point in the exam as well. Anytime it gets uncomfortable or it's just too long or you can't do it, that is your right to say no. A trained nurse will be very good about asking you, is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? So, you will get very compassionate care usually from the nursing staff and the victim advocates. And so, yeah, that's as much as I, would know, from doing all the research. It really varies state by state. There's some really interesting experiments. There's one in Nevada where there's very little access to reporting in the hospitals. So this nurse has she has a van and she goes right to the survivors. Seems like a great idea. But yeah, you might want to know ahead of time. You might want to know how to help yourself or a friend and tap into. There's a lot of resources in the immediate after, just to find out where to go. There's great sources on the internet. I mean, I think if you even put in the word rape into Google, it'll be like these sites from RAINN or these advocate sites will jump up and tell you and suggest a hospital or give you a hotline. You can also call a hotline that will help you find care.
What is the key message that you hope readers take away from reading your book?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. The key message is, this is our system. It belongs to us. We paid for it. We deserve the right to have opinions about it and to change it if it's not working and to fix it. And I think one weird thing, you guys started with what is the rape kit? So many interviews start that way. And the other mission for me is, if the kit is invisible, if people don't really know what it is and how it works and what it's supposed to be, it can be taken away. And believe me, there are people trying to take it away. I want the kit to be visible. I want this whole system to be visible and transparent, and I want people to look at it. And, what you take away, I don't have the solutions. Those should come from the survivors. But certainly we need to take the power back in this system.
I know you didn't get to meet Marty Goddard, but anything you would have said to her, asked her?
Oh, there was so much. Honestly, as this search for her went on, wanted to go see her and talk to her and hear her story, essentially, as much as she remembered of it at that time. I had oral history tapes and stuff, but I just so wanted to fully hear it, and about her childhood and about everything. There were so many. I just wanted the full 10-hour download of her story. And I was able to talk to her sister, and that gave me incredible insight into their childhood and how she became such a fighter and so aware of things, of issues, and how, in fact, she herself ran away from home. But yes, my whole effort, my passion for trying to find her was I want to know again, Vitulo's not alive. A lot of these people aren't alive anymore. I want the full story. I want to hear it. And, I did, by patching together a lot of accounts from people who are still alive, and some amazing, when you go back into the newspapers, boy, you see a lot of interesting stuff. So I was able to really piece together a story, but it just doesn't compare to, the kind of account you can get from somebody who was at the center of it.
People who do this work or who have done this work have not heard of Marty Goddard, and you bringing that out into the forefront is important.
I hope so. I think there's something about a story that helps people care about a political issue, so in a way that they might not, or it just would be too abstract or something.
Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was really fun. And but happy you guys are doing what you do.
Thank you for the good work. Thank you. A big thank you to Pagan for sharing the story of Marty Goddard and the history of the rape kit, which had been paramount in solving sexual assault cases all over the world. Go grab a copy of Pagan's book, The Secret History of the Rape Kit, a true crime story. It's available on Amazon and wherever books are sold.
Make sure to check out www.pagankennedy.space to explore more of her work, and we'll have that link in our show notes on our website. That's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. You can follow us on social media. We are on TikTok, X, Instagram, Threads, and be sure to subscribe to us. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, CastBox. We're everywhere. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Until then.